Hi everyone, it's Dasha here and welcome back to my channel, a place for those of you learning English or looking for personal development tips and so much more. Today I want to talk about the basic vocabulary you need to know for the IELTS writing task, and specifically task 2. The reason I'm doing this video is because I wanted to share with you my own personal experience and the mistakes that I've made in the writing task. Now, I've done both the IELTS academic and general training. I sat the IELTS academic about a couple of years ago, and I recently did the IELTS general training. But I made a huge mistake in the writing task of the IELTS general training because my writing was just way too informal. As a result, I got a band 7, which is quite embarrassing for a person that works in the legal industry in the UK. Before we get into it, the main thing you need to know about the IELTS is that it's a very tricky exam, even for a native speaker, because it's all about trying to collect as many marks as possible. And vocabulary accounts for 25% of your grade for the writing task, so it would be a huge shame to miss those marks by being unprepared. The number one thing to avoid is the use of everyday idioms. In my essay, I used phrases like "it takes a village to raise children," which I thought was cool and showed my writing skills, but I was so wrong. Apparently, you're not supposed to use everyday idioms because they're just way too informal. Examples of idioms to avoid are "at the end of the day," "to cut to the chase," "the elephant in the room," and quite shockingly, I think, "in the modern era" or "since the dawn of time. Next, you should also avoid using contractions. So instead of don't, you should use do not. Instead of shouldn't, you should use should not, and so on. Now, I personally didn't make this mistake, but I know it's sometimes quite easy to get sidetracked and accidentally use contractions when you're in a rush and doing an exam. You need to also pay attention to the types of linking words you're using. Never, ever, ever start sentences with words like and, but, or, also, or so. Instead, substitute the word and with moreover, but with however, or with alternatively, or in the alternative, or conversely, also with furthermore, and so with as a result, or maybe even as such. For example, instead of saying also fuel-based vehicles are large contributors to pollution, you could say furthermore, fuel-based vehicles are a large contributor to pollution. Moving on, you should also absolutely avoid using shortened versions of words. For example, by shortened words, I mean you should never write the word phone, but instead you should say telephone. The same goes for words like fridge and refrigerator, photo and photograph, pic and picture, info and information. You should also refrain from writing etc, as well as and so on. Instead of, for example, saying something like cars, trains, buses, etc and so on, you could say such as cars and trains. Simple as that. Now, let's talk about general vocabulary. Your score in writing will depend on different factors, one of which is your level of lexical resources, basically your range of vocabulary. But there are some words that you really shouldn't use because they lower your mark quite significantly. Let's start with the phrases first and foremost, last but not least, and in a nutshell. Since the words first and foremost mean basically the same thing, It's unnecessary to say both. Instead, you could just say firstly. Likewise, instead of last but not least, you could just say lastly. In a nutshell is an informal way of summing up your essay. Simply use either in conclusion or to conclude, and that's it. Next, you should also steer clear of using I reckon or any personal pronouns for that matter. That's because it just sounds informal. You could alternatively say it can perhaps be more strongly supported that, or even it could be argued that to sound a little bit more sophisticated. Similarly, instead of saying you or your, you can replace them with the word one. Take this sentence as an example. If you fail, you must try harder next time. You can substitute the word you with one and say, if one fails, then one must try harder next time. As I said before, is also something you should not write in your IELTS essay. As my English teacher used to say, if you already said it, then why say it again? But if you're trying to make a valid point or argument, you could say, as previously alluded to or as previously referred to. Also, the phrase, the point I'm trying to make is, could be easily changed to, the relevant point is that, or the primary point is that. There's also a whole bunch of words that are generally too colloquial or simple for the IELTS writing task. For example, don't use the word some. Be more specific. So instead of saying something like, some tax laws will make wealthy people richer, you could say, there should be a law that requires wealthy people to pay higher taxes. Also, try not to use people and say exactly who you are referring to. For example, individuals, citizens, youth, mature adults, or employers. Similarly, using generalizations like all and every in a way reflect an immature way of thinking. So as an example in the sentence, every person loves watching movies, you could say a large portion of the world loves watching movies. There are also a few basic words that you could substitute to not lose marks. And by the way, if you want to see these words with examples, check out the link to them in the description box below. So let's look at some of them. Give can be provide. Instead of saying a lot of or lots of, you could say many, a great deal, a plethora, or a shocking quantity. Rather than saying more and more, just say more. Instead of the word crazy, you could use the word absurd. Never use the word kids, instead refer to them as children. If you want to use an intensifier like very, use the word exceedingly or extremely. Rather than saying show, you could say demonstrate or illustrate. Rather than saying big, you could say large or significant or even sizable. Instead of bad, use words like poor or negative. Substitute good for satisfactory, acceptable, or stellar. Rather than saying besides, you could say additionally or in addition to. Instead of saying a couple, you could say several. Think about is a very basic term. Try using consider instead. Rather than find out, you could say discover. And instead of look at, you could say examine, review, or analyze. To point something out is also quite simple. A more sophisticated way of saying it is to indicate. Do not ever use kind of or sort of. Instead, use the word somewhat. Well, that's all from me today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you're preparing for the IELTS, make sure to check out the list of the words and phrases mentioned in today's video with examples in the description box below. And finally, let the YouTube algorithm know that you've enjoyed this video by giving it a thumbs up and by hitting that subscribe button if you want to see more awesome content. See you in the next video. Bye!